Hello, my name is Chris Teutsch. I work at Virginia Tech's Southern Piedmont Research Station. We're located just outside of Blackstone, Virginia. And I'd like to welcome you to Horse Pastures 101. These are a series of short videos ranging anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes that focus on improving your horse pastures. The first video in this series is focusing on understanding forage plant growth and how it relates to grazing management. Today I want to cover several topics. The first one is physiology, and that's just a fancy word for what's going on inside that plant, those vital processes that are taking place within that plant. We won't talk about all of them, but we'll talk about a few. And then we'll talk a little bit about the morphology. That's a physical form of the plant. Does it grow upright? Does it grow along the soil surface? And we'll talk about how these two things interact, the physiology and the morphology of the plant, to determine how we should be managing that plant under grazing. The first process that I want to talk about today is photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is by far the most important biochemical process on Earth. Without photosynthesis, none of us would be sitting here today. All it is simply taking light energy from the sun and converting it into chemical energy, and this takes place in plants. This is the chemical equation for photosynthesis. We take carbon dioxide from the air, water from the soil, and we turn it into sugar, and an important byproduct for us is oxygen. And this all takes place in the chloroplast of the cell. And the chloroplast contains the special machinery that's needed to carry out the photosynthetic process. This whole process is driven by light energy from the sun. When we talk about our grasses, we have two major photosynthetic pathways. We have our C3 pathway that we find in our cool season grasses, and the C3 pathway is much better adapted to carrying out photosynthesis at cooler temperatures. So we'll see the most growth in our cool season grasses in the spring and in the fall. Not much going on in the summertime, because in the summertime, photosynthesis is temperature limited in our cool season grasses. So even if we add more water during the summer months, we can't efficiently carry out photosynthesis because the temperature is limiting the photosynthetic process. Now, in contrast, we find our C4 pathway in our warm season grasses. And this is much more efficient carrying out photosynthesis at higher temperatures. In fact, we don't reach optimum photosynthesis in our warm season grasses until we get to that 90 to 100 degree range. The other difference between our C3 and C4 grasses is that our C4 grasses, or our warm season grasses, are much more efficient at using water during the summer months. So we'll produce about twice as much growth per unit of water used in the summer months in our warm season grasses compared with our cool season grasses. So as you can see, in the ideal grazing system, we'd want some cool season grasses and some warm season grasses so that we have growth during the spring and the fall and also during the summer months. A lot of times when I talk about photosynthesis and I put that chemical formula up, people's eyes kind of glaze over and they kind of lose interest. And I always like to talk about photosynthesis kind of from a model standpoint. And this is what I call the photosynthetic factory. And our photosynthetic factory in this example is the plant leaf. And like any factory, we're going to produce a product. And to produce a product, we have to have raw materials. And our raw materials are sunlight, water, nutrients, and carbon dioxide. And they go into the factory, and then we produce our product, which is sugars and carbohydrates. And in this example, we abbreviate carbohydrates CHO. Okay, so we're producing sugars and carbohydrates in our photosynthetic factory. Important byproduct for us, again, is oxygen, which is coming out the stacks on the factory. And then that product can go to two places. It can go either to the consumer outlet, where it's used for growth and maintenance of that plant, or it can be stored up in a warehouse, where it's saved and used at a later time. And what determines where it goes? Well, in a plant, what always gets first billing is the consumer outlet. So growth and maintenance always gets first billing in a plant. If we're not meeting the needs, the energy needs of growth and maintenance, all the sugars and carbohydrates get shifted to growth and maintenance. Now, once our photosynthetic factory gets big enough and gets enough leaf area on that plant that we're producing more energy than we need for growth and maintenance of the plant, the extra sugars and carbohydrates get shifted into the warehouse, where they're stored up to use at a later date. This warehouse is really important in plants because it provides energy for regrowth after stressful events. So after grazing, it can use that extra energy, those sugars and carbohydrates in that warehouse for regrowth. After a drought period, we can use those sugars and carbohydrates for regrowth that are stored up in that warehouse. So having that warehouse as full as we can get it all the time is going to make for a very healthy pasture. And if you kind of understand this diagram, you kind of understand the whole basis of rotational grazing. Rotational grazing is nothing more than managing this photosynthetic factory, this plant canopy, this leaf area in a pasture. We're giving that leaf area time to rest after grazing. We're controlling how close we graze that leaf area, how big that photosynthetic factory is. And by doing that, we can maintain a healthy and vigorous sod, which is going to produce forage for our horses and protect the environment at the same time. I want to talk just a little bit about plant morphology. And when we talk about our grasses, we have two kinds of growth habit. We have what we call our bunch type grasses. They kind of grow in clumps. A lot of times when those clumps are close together in a pasture, that looks like a solid sod. But when we start to look at individual plants, they're really a clump type grass. They tend to have tillers that grow upward, and they include things like orchard grass and tall fescue. And then we have what we call our sod formers, and they include things like Bermuda grass and Kentucky bluegrass, and they have structures called stolons and rhizomes, which are modified stems that kind of grow out and creep along the soil surface, or just under the soil surface. And they tend to spread out and form a very dense sod. One of the nice things about the sod formers are when we have a damage to that sod, they will actually fill that damaged area back in. That doesn't happen with our bunch type grasses like orchard grass and tall fescue. When we have a damage in those sods, we tend to get weeds in those open spaces. So just by knowing a little bit about how a plant grows, we can tell a little bit about how we should manage that plant under grazing. For example, if we have a bunch type grass that has this erect growth habit, it tends to be less tolerant to close and frequent grazing. So we'll want to manage that plant a little bit differently under grazing versus a plant that has prostrate growth or that growth along the soil surface like a sod former would have. They tend to be more tolerant of close and frequent grazing. I want to talk about a couple other structures of grasses and legumes, and the first one is the root system. We have two different kinds of root systems when we look at a grass and a legume. A legume would be something like alfalfa or clover, and those plants actually will fix nitrogen from the air into a plant available form. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about soil fertility in pastures. And legumes tend to have what we call a taproot system. That's one primary root that goes fairly deep in the soil that has branches off of it. Our grass has what we call a fibrous root system. So that's lots of little fibrous roots very close to the soil surface. 90% of the roots in a grass plant will be in that upper 8 to 10 inches of the soil surface. And that makes that plant really efficient at capturing water when it rains and capturing nutrients that are surface supplied, but not so efficient at being persistent during a drought, because when that 8 to 10 inches of soil dries out on top, that plant tends to be under drought stress. Now, something like alfalfa that'll have a taproot that goes down 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 feet or even deeper into the soil can be fairly drought tolerant because it reaches down below that soil surface to find water during dry times. The other structures I want to talk about are those modified stems that I referred to in the previous slide, and those are rhizomes and stolons. A rhizome grows just below the soil surface, and that's shown in this diagram. And wherever there's a node in that rhizome, a new plant can arise. And the same thing with the stolon, except the stolon grows just above the soil surface. And the nice thing about stolons and rhizomes, they allow those plants to spread out. That's what sod formers have, and fill in areas that are damaged in that sod. The other thing that stolons and rhizomes do is that they store carbohydrates. And the nice thing is about stolons and rhizomes is they store those carbohydrates below the grazing height of the animal. So even though an animal would graze a sod former very closely, it's still retaining those stored carbohydrates. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. So we have a defoliation event taking place here. And as you can see, horses graze really close if you let them. And that's one thing that we have to focus on managing is that grazing habit of horses. So if we have enough water and we've got the correct soil fertility and our pH is good in our soil, we don't need any lime, and we got plenty of sunlight, what do we need for regrowth? And the answer's the same as anything that we need to do work. Whether it's turn a light bulb on or drive our car, we need energy. We need energy for that plant to regrow with. And in our grass plants, that energy comes from two places. It comes from that photosynthetic factory or that leaf area remaining after grazing. We can kind of think of that leaf area as a big photosynthetic panel. The closer we graze it, the smaller that panel gets. The more leaf area that we leave after we graze through that pasture, the larger that photosynthetic panel is. So it comes from that leaf area that we leave in that photosynthesis taking place in that leaf area, and then it comes from stored carbohydrates in that plant, that warehouse that we talked about. So two places in grasses, leaf area remaining and stored carbohydrates. Non-structural carbohydrates are simply substances within that plant to provide energy for regrowth and persistence of that plant. And there's lots of factors that affect stored carbohydrates in the plants. But a good general rule is that anything that impacts photosynthesis is going to impact stored carbohydrates within that plant. This is just another diagram kind of similar to that photosynthetic factory that I showed you. We've got photosynthesis going on here. We've got sucrose being produced. That's a sugar. And the first thing, the first place it always goes is to growth and maintenance of that plant. Once we're meeting the growth and maintenance requirements, the extra can get shifted into storage for later use. And it's important you understand this because this is the whole basis of rotational grazing. Resting our pastures, allowing it to store energy up for regrowth, allowing it to regrow that leaf area so that we're producing more sugars and carbohydrates needed for growth and maintenance, and the extra can get stored up for later use. This is kind of a busy table, and I'm going to break it down for you, but this shows the location of carbohydrate reserves in plants. And let's take, for example, orchard grass. Orchard grass stores its carbohydrates in the base of the stem, so near the bottom of the plant is where it's storing its carbohydrates at. So what's that mean? That means that when we have our horse in a pasture of orchard grass and it grazes that pasture really close, not only did we remove that photosynthetic factory, but we also removed the warehouse, the place where those carbohydrates are stored at within that plant. And that's important to understand. That means that we need to be managing orchard grass for a little bit higher residual height within that pasture, so we don't remove those stored carbohydrates. Now, if we move on to something like Bermuda grass that has a lot of its energy stored in the stolons and rhizomes of that plant, and those are right at the soil surface or just below it, safely below the grazing height of the animal, that means that that Bermuda grass is going to be more tolerant to close and frequent grazing because those stored energy sources, those warehouse, is below the grazing height of the animal. So the point that I want you to take home from this whole table is that we need to think about where that energy reserve is in that plant, where it's stored at, and then adjust our grazing management so that we leave that storage organ on that plant. I'm going to talk a little bit about carbohydrate cycling in forage plants, and I like to use alfalfa as an example because alfalfa is one forage plant that is 100% dependent upon stored carbohydrates for regrowth. When we cut an alfalfa hayfield, what you'll notice when we're done is that there's no leaf area left in that field. Basically, all there is stubble and stems of plants. But it regrows very rapidly. So energy is coming from somewhere. In alfalfa, it comes from carbohydrates stored in the taproot of the plant. So if you'll notice, we have a defoliation event taking place, and then that plant starts to regrow. As that plant starts to regrow, the concentration of non-structural carbohydrates in the plant, in the taproot, goes down dramatically, and that's represented by that line on the bottom of the graph. And that keeps decreasing until we get about 6 to 8 inches of regrowth on that plant. What happens at that point is that the photosynthetic factory is large enough that it's fixing through photosynthesis more sugars and carbohydrates than are needed for growth and maintenance of that plant. So the extra ones get shifted back into storage, so the non-structural carbohydrates in the taproot of that plant starts to increase. And by the time we're ready to cut that field again, in about 30 to 35 days, we're back up to pre-cut levels in terms of stored carbohydrates in that plant, in that taproot of the plant. All forages have a carbohydrate cycle. It's most pronounced in alfalfa, but all forage plants have a carbohydrate cycle. And it's important to realize that, because what would happen to this alfalfa plant if we grazed it, and then we let it regrow to 6 to 8 inches, and then we grazed it again? So we would be using more of those carbohydrates up, and more of those carbohydrates, and more of those carbohydrates, and eventually the regrowth of this plant would slow down, and slow down, and slow down, and eventually it would die because it ran out of energy to regrow with. And that's what happens in a pasture which is overgrazed by horses. The plants never get a chance to recover. They never get a chance to store those carbohydrates back up. They never get a chance to rebuild that photosynthetic factory in that pasture. And this is the whole premise of rotational stocking. We're resting the pasture. We're letting these carbohydrates build back up so that we have lots of carbohydrates in the warehouse of that plant. This is a nice diagram, and this is from a publication by Dr. Blazer. And Dr. Blazer was a forage scientist at Virginia Tech many years ago. And these diagrams are still very much applicable. And this is actually a grass tiller, so that's one piece of a total grass plant. And what I want you to see is this structure called the collar on the leaf. This collar right here on the leaf of the plant is, when that's showing, that means this leaf blade right here, number 4, is not going to regrow anymore. Now, what you can't see from this, because it's a black and white diagram, is that this leaf is still green. And green means that it's still carrying out photosynthesis. So the question is what do we do with that leaf? If it's not growing, actively growing, do we leave it or do we keep it? And the answer is we probably want to think about keeping it, because it's not actively growing, it's still photosynthesizing. That energy is going back down into the plant and helping to fuel growth of these new leaves that are coming out. And that's important. And the point that I want to make with this diagram is that we want to stop and we want to leave some residual leaf area in pastures. Even though these leaves may not be actively regrowing, what they're doing is capturing sunlight, turning it into sugars and carbohydrates, and fueling regrowth of leaves coming out. So if we leave a little bit more leaf area in a pasture, say 4 inches instead of 2 inches, our regrowth is going to be much quicker and our pastures are going to be healthier. This is a busy diagram, but it drives home a very important point when we start talking about the interaction between what's in our warehouse, the carbohydrates are stored up in our warehouse, and the leaf area that's remaining after grazing. So I broke this diagram down into two pieces with this blue line right here. And what we see is, if we divide this in half, is that this half has a high carbohydrate status, and we could equate that to a rotationally stocked pasture. So essentially we're resting our pastures between grazing events and allowing it to store up energy in that warehouse. This other side is a continuously stocked pasture, and what we're doing there is we can have a low carbohydrate status in our plants. So we're never resting our pastures. Every time they grow a little bit, we're nipping those leaves off, and that leads to a low carbohydrate status. And then we do two other things. We either leave 2 inches of leaf area, or we take all the leaf area away. And then we look at the regrowth that comes in each pasture. And what we see is in our rotationally grazed pastures, we have 1 inch of regrowth and 4 new tillers formed. If we go to the other extreme, no leaf area left in low carbohydrate status, we have less than half as much regrowth and half as many tillers formed. This is an important diagram. If you understand this, you understand the whole concept of why it's so important that we manage grazing within our pastures. So go home and take a look at this diagram again and really think about this. The last thing I want to talk about is a little bit about what's going on underneath the ground. And we don't talk enough about this, but what we do to the top of the plant impacts what's below the ground. If we remove 50% of the shoots, and this was a study done by Kreider in the 1950s, we stop root growth. If we remove 90% of the shoots, we stop root growth for 17 days. 3 clippings per week, so that's kind of what we kind of find in horse pastures. They're constantly clipping those plants off. They never get a chance to regrow. They never get a chance to rest. Root growth never resumed. If we took only 40% of the top of the plant, then root growth never stopped. The point I want to make with this slide is that what we do to the top of the plant impacts what's below that plant. So if we have a continuously stocked pasture, our root system is going to be smaller. This is a rotationally grazed plant in the center, and this is a laxly managed plant, not really utilized on the far side. The point is when we get into a drought stress, this plant in the middle that's rotationally stocked is going to be in a much better position to make it through that drought stress because it has a much larger root system than this plant here that's continuously grazed. All right, I kind of want to tie things up and bring this concept of plant morphology and physiology together. And this diagram does a nice job of this. What I want you to focus on this diagram is first the orchard grass. We see this dashed line here. This is a grazing height of less than 2 inches, so it's pretty tight. If we look at what's left below this line, we see it's mostly stems. And then say we get pretty low, and we're not only removing all the leaf area of this plant, so that photosynthetic factory, but we're also getting down into the stem base. And in orchard grass, if you remember, the energy or the carbohydrates were stored in the stem base. So we're kind of putting what I call the double whammy on orchard grass with close and frequent grazing. And orchard grass is not going to do well under this type of management. Now, if we contrast that with something like Bermuda grass, there's a lot of leaf area left underneath this close grazing height, plus the energy is stored in these stolons and rhizomes. So under a close grazing height, Bermuda grass is going to be much more persistent than orchard grass. And the same thing holds true for bluegrass. It's got more leaf area below that close grazing height, plus it's storing its energy in these undergrown rhizome structures. So the point that I want to make is that understanding a little bit about the morphology and the physiology of plants really helps us understand how to manage that plant under grazing. In the next Horse Pastures 101, we're going to talk about how to set up a rotational stocking system and how to manage that system. So please, if you have time, take a few minutes and watch that video. The last thing I want to mention is that we have a tremendous resource in cooperative extension. And every state has a cooperative extension source. In most cases, we have either a regional or a county-based extension agent. And those people are tremendous resources for you at a local level. If you've got questions about grazing management or what forage species to plant in your pastures or how to take a soil test, call your local extension office and they will help you come up with a solution to your questions or your problems. So with that, take care. I wish you lots of rain and lots of green grass. Until next time.